The summer of 1990, in Ocean View Heights, California, was supposed to be magical for 16-year-old Isabella Marie Cunningham. The coastal town's golden beaches stretched for miles, and the Victorian mansions perched on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean painted a picture of timeless elegance. For Isabella, it was the summer she would become a woman, celebrated in the grand tradition of a sweet 16 party that her wealthy parents had been planning for months. Isabella was the daughter of Robert Harrison Cunningham, a prominent real estate developer who had built half the luxury homes in Ocean View Heights, and Margaret Elizabeth Thornton Cunningham, a former debutante from old California money whose family had owned vineyards in Napa Valley for 3 generations. The Cunninghams were pillars of the community, active members of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, and known for their philanthropy and social standing. But on the night of August 15, 1990, during what should have been the most memorable celebration of Isabella's young life, she vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions, heartbreak, and a mystery that would haunt Ocean View Heights for decades. The morning of August 15 dawned crystal clear, with the kind of perfect California sunshine that made Ocean View Heights a coveted destination for the wealthy and influential. Isabella woke early in her bedroom on the 3rd floor of the family's sprawling estate, a magnificent Victorian mansion called Rosehaven, that sat on 3 acres of manicured gardens overlooking the ocean. "Isabella, darling, today is your special day," called Margaret from the doorway, carrying a tray with fresh strawberries and cream, Isabella's favorite breakfast. Margaret Cunningham was an elegant woman of 42, with honey blonde hair always perfectly styled and a wardrobe that could grace the pages of Vogue. But this morning, her usually composed demeanor showed hints of excitement and nervousness. Isabella stretched luxuriously in her canopy bed, surrounded by the soft pink and gold decor that had been her sanctuary since childhood. At 16, she was blossoming into a remarkable young woman, tall and graceful like her mother, with her father's intelligent green eyes and a smile that could light up any room. More importantly, Isabella possessed a genuine kindness and deep faith that set her apart from many of her privileged peers. "I still can't believe this day is finally here," Isabella said, sitting up and accepting the breakfast tray. "Sometimes I feel like I'm dreaming. A real sweet 16 party, just like the ones we've seen in magazines." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her expression growing tender. "You deserve every beautiful moment of today, sweetheart. Your father and I are so proud of the young woman you've become. Your faith, your compassion for others, your dedication to your studies, you're everything we could have hoped for in a daughter." Isabella had always been different from other wealthy teenagers in Ocean View Heights. While her classmates at the exclusive Ocean View Preparatory Academy spent their free time shopping or gossiping, Isabella volunteered at the local homeless shelter, taught Sunday school to younger children at St. Matthew's, and spent hours in prayer and Bible study. Her faith was not just inherited tradition but a living, breathing relationship with God that guided every aspect of her life. "Mrs. Patterson from the shelter called yesterday," Isabella said, taking a bite of strawberry. 3 new families arrived this week, including 2 children about the age of my Sunday school students. I was thinking, maybe after the party dies down tomorrow, I could bring some of my gifts to share with them. I certainly don't need everything people will give me tonight." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of pride. "That's exactly what I would expect you to say, Isabella. Your generous heart is one of your most beautiful qualities. But tonight, let yourself be celebrated. God delights in blessing His children, and you deserve to enjoy every moment of this celebration." The day passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The event planning company that Margaret had hired months ago transformed the mansion's ballroom and gardens into a fairy tale setting. Thousands of white roses and baby's breath created an enchanted atmosphere, while strings of tiny white lights turned the outdoor terraces into something magical. A dance floor had been installed on the main terrace overlooking the ocean, and round tables draped in ivory silk surrounded the space. Isabella's dress was a masterpiece, a custom creation by a renowned designer in Beverly Hills. Made of ivory silk with delicate pearl and crystal beading, it featured a fitted bodice and a flowing skirt that made Isabella look like a princess from a storybook. The dress had taken 3 months to complete, with multiple fittings to ensure it was absolutely perfect. The seamstress outdid herself, Margaret said as she helped Isabella into the gown late that afternoon. "You look absolutely breathtaking, darling. Your grandmother's pearls are the perfect finishing touch." Isabella admired herself in the full-length mirror in her dressing room, but something seemed to catch her attention. As Margaret fastened the pearl necklace around her neck, Isabella ran her fingers along the inner lining of the dress's bodice. "Mother, does this feel strange to you?" Isabella asked, pressing gently against the fabric near her waist. "It's like there's something sewn into the lining here." Margaret examined the area Isabella indicated, feeling the slight irregularity in the fabric. "It's probably just extra interfacing or padding for structure, sweetheart. These formal gowns often have multiple layers of support built in. Don't worry about it, you look absolutely perfect." By 7 o'clock, guests began arriving at Rosehaven. The guest list included 200 of Ocean View Heights' most prominent families, Isabella's classmates from prep school, and several family friends who had traveled from as far as New York and Texas for the celebration. The local society photographer was there to capture every moment, and a string quartet played classical music as guests enjoyed cocktails and hors d'oeuvres on the terrace. Isabella moved through the party like the gracious hostess she had been trained to be, thanking guests for coming, accepting congratulations and gifts, and posing for countless photographs. She danced with her father to "The Way You Look Tonight," fought back tears during a heartfelt toast from her maternal grandfather who had flown in from San Francisco, and laughed with her closest friends from school. But several guests later remembered that as the evening progressed, Isabella seemed increasingly distracted. She was seen checking her watch frequently and scanning the crowd as if looking for someone in particular. "She kept glancing toward the garden gates," recalled Amanda Sinclair, Isabella's best friend since childhood. "When I asked her if she was expecting someone else, she just smiled and said she hoped a special friend might be able to make it. I assumed she meant some boy she had a crush on, but she wouldn't give me any details." At approximately 9:30 p.m., as the party reached its peak with nearly all 200 guests in attendance, Isabella excused herself from a conversation with her prep school headmaster and his wife. She told several people she was going to freshen up and would be right back. That was the last time anyone at the party saw Isabella Cunningham alive. Margaret noticed her daughter's absence first, around 10 p.m. when it was time for the traditional Sweet 16 candle ceremony. Isabella's personal maid, Rosa Martinez, was sent to check Isabella's bedroom, but found it empty. A systematic search of the mansion's 32 rooms revealed no trace of the birthday girl. "At first, we thought maybe she had stepped outside for some air," Robert Cunningham later told police. "Isabella sometimes felt overwhelmed in large crowds, and we thought she might have gone to her favorite spot in the rose garden to collect herself. But when we searched every inch of the 3-acre property and found no sign of her, we knew something was terribly wrong." The Ocean View Heights Police Department was called at 10:45 p.m. Officers arrived to find a party in chaos, 200 worried guests, frantic parents, and no clues about what had happened to the guest of honor. Detective Michael O'Connor, a 20-year veteran of the force, took charge of the initial investigation. "In my experience, teenagers sometimes get overwhelmed by big events and need space," Detective O'Connor told the Cunninghams that night. "Has Isabella been under any unusual stress lately? Any problems at school, with friends, or family issues we should know about?" Both parents insisted that Isabella had been her normal, happy self. "She was an excellent student, had never been in any trouble, and maintained close relationships with family and friends. The only unusual aspect of her recent behavior had been her frequent trips to the homeless shelter and her increased time spent in prayer and Bible study. "If anything, she's been more focused on her faith lately," Margaret told the detective. "She's been reading her Bible more, spending longer in prayer each morning, and talking about feeling called to do more service work. But that's not unusual for Isabella. She's always been spiritually mature for her age." The initial search revealed few clues. Isabella's purse was found in her bedroom, containing her identification, some cash, and the usual items a 16-year-old might carry. Her car keys were in their usual spot on her dresser. Most telling, the expensive diamond bracelet that her parents had given her that morning, her main birthday gift, was found on her nightstand, suggesting she had removed it intentionally. That bracelet was worth over $50,000, Robert Cunningham told investigators. Isabella loved it and had been wearing it all evening, showing it to friends and thanking us repeatedly for such a generous gift. For her to take it off and leave it behind suggests this wasn't a spontaneous decision. The grounds of Rosehaven were searched thoroughly by police and volunteers throughout the night and into the next day. The mansion sat on a cliff-top location with carefully maintained gardens, a tennis court, and a swimming pool. Beyond the property's wrought iron gates lay a winding coastal road that connected to the Pacific Coast Highway. Police found no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the property, and no indication of how Isabella might have left. News of Isabella's disappearance spread quickly through Ocean View Heights and beyond. The story made front-page headlines in the Los Angeles Times: "Wealthy Teen Vanishes During Sweet 16 Party." Television news crews descended on the quiet coastal town, and the Cunningham family found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police interviewed all 200 party guests, staff members who had worked the event, and anyone who might have had contact with Isabella in the days leading up to her disappearance. They found a young woman universally loved and respected, with no known enemies and no obvious reason to disappear voluntarily. "Everyone we spoke to described Isabella as remarkable," Detective O'Connor reported to his superiors. "Her teachers say she was one of the best students they'd ever had, not just academically, but in terms of character and maturity. Her friends describe her as loyal, kind, and deeply religious. Her volunteer supervisors at the homeless shelter say she was the most dedicated teenage volunteer they'd ever seen. This isn't a troubled kid acting out." 3 days after Isabella's disappearance, on August 18, 1990, a groundskeeper making his morning rounds at the Ocean View Country Club made a discovery that would deepen the mystery exponentially. In the pool house of the club's most expensive property, a cliff-top mansion known as the Peninsula Estate, he found Isabella's Sweet 16 dress, carefully hung on a hanger as if someone had just removed it. The Peninsula Estate belonged to Vincent Charles Blackwood, a 62-year-old oil executive who divided his time between homes in Texas, New York, and California. Blackwood was known in Ocean View Heights as a reclusive millionaire who rarely attended social events and kept to himself when in residence. He had been out of town on business during Isabella's party and had no apparent connection to the Cunningham family. Detective O'Connor and his team processed the dress as evidence, but initial examination revealed no obvious clues. The gown appeared to be in perfect condition, no tears, no stains, no signs of violence. It had been hung with care, almost as if someone had wanted to preserve it. The positioning of the dress was strange, crime scene technician Linda Hayes noted in her report. It wasn't thrown aside or hidden. It was hanging properly on a padded hanger in the master bedroom's walk-in closet, like someone had just finished wearing it to a formal event. The discovery raised more questions than answers. How had Isabella's dress ended up in a mansion belonging to a man she had never met? Had she gone there willingly, or had someone taken her there against her will? And most puzzling of all, if Isabella had removed the dress herself, where was she now, and what was she wearing? Vincent Blackwood was immediately contacted by police in Houston, where he was attending business meetings. He expressed shock and confusion about the discovery and insisted he had no knowledge of how the dress had gotten into his California home. "I haven't been to the Ocean View house since early July," Blackwood told investigators via phone. "I was planning to return after Labor Day, but I've been in Texas for the past month on oil rig inspections. I have no idea how that dress got into my house, and I've never met the Cunningham family or their daughter." Blackwood's alibi checked out completely. Hotel records, business meeting schedules, and multiple witnesses confirmed he had been in Texas continuously since July 29. Security cameras at his Houston office building showed him entering and leaving regularly during the time of Isabella's disappearance. The Peninsula estate itself yielded few additional clues. The mansion had a sophisticated alarm system, but it had not been activated during Blackwood's absence. The housekeeper, Maria Santos, had keys to the property and was responsible for weekly maintenance visits, but she insisted she had last been to the house on August 10, 5 days before Isabella's disappearance, and had seen nothing unusual. Someone with knowledge of the property had to have placed that dress there, Detective O'Connor concluded. This wasn't random. Someone knew Mr. Blackwood was out of town, knew the alarm wouldn't be set, and knew exactly where to go within that large house. The investigation into Isabella's disappearance consumed Ocean View Heights for months. The FBI was called in due to the possibility of kidnapping across state lines. Private investigators hired by the Cunningham family pursued every possible lead. Psychics, profilers, and volunteers from across California joined the search efforts. But as 1990 turned to 1991, and then to 1992, the case grew cold. Despite the massive effort and extensive resources devoted to finding Isabella, no additional evidence emerged. The beautiful 16-year-old had simply vanished, leaving behind only her designer dress and a community forever changed by her disappearance. The Cunningham family never recovered from the loss. Margaret fell into a deep depression that required extensive therapy and medication. Robert threw himself into his business with obsessive intensity, as if constant work could somehow fill the void left by his daughter's absence. The couple's marriage, once strong and loving, crumbled under the weight of grief and unanswered questions. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where Isabella had been such a dedicated member, struggled with the theological implications of her disappearance. How could a loving God allow such a faithful young woman to simply vanish? Pastor David Wellington tried to counsel his congregation through their crisis of faith, but privately struggled with his own questions about divine justice and protection. Isabella's disappearance tested everyone's faith, Pastor Wellington later reflected. She was proof that good things happen to good people, that faith and kindness are rewarded. When she vanished, it shook the foundation of what many people believed about God's care for his children. The years passed slowly in Ocean View Heights. The town's atmosphere changed from one of coastal charm and affluent tranquility to something more somber and watchful. Parents became more protective of their children. Social events lost some of their carefree spirit. The Cunningham mansion, once the scene of elegant parties and community gatherings, stood mostly empty after Margaret and Robert divorced in 1995 and sold the property. But in the summer of 2015, 25 years after Isabella's disappearance, a discovery would finally shed light on the mystery that had haunted Ocean View Heights for a quarter century. And that discovery would reveal not just what happened to Isabella Cunningham, but why her faith had been so important in her final days, and how her disappearance had been part of a much larger story of corruption, greed, and ultimate divine justice. The revelation began with a phone call to the Ocean View Heights Police Department on June 3, 2015. The caller was Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a trauma surgeon at Santa Barbara General Hospital who had grown up in Ocean View Heights and remembered Isabella's disappearance from her own childhood. "I have Isabella Cunningham's Suite 16 dress," Dr. Rodriguez told the dispatcher. "My grandmother just passed away, and while cleaning out her house, we found it in a trunk in her attic. There's something sewn into the lining that I think you need to see." Dr. Rodriguez's grandmother, Elena Santos, had been the housekeeper at the Peninsula Estate in 1990, the same woman who had found Isabella's dress hanging in Vincent Blackwood's closet. Elena had passed away at age 93, taking with her a secret she had carried for 25 years. When Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had taken over cold cases for the department, arrived at Elena Santos' modest home on the outskirts of Ocean View Heights, she found Dr. Rodriguez and her family carefully examining the white gown that had been preserved in a cedar trunk for decades. "My grandmother left a letter explaining everything," Dr. Rodriguez said, handing Detective Mitchell a handwritten note in Spanish. "She was terrified for 25 years, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy the dress because she knew it contained evidence." Elena's letter, translated into English, revealed the truth about Isabella's final night. "I cannot take this secret to my grave. On the night of August 15, 1990, I was cleaning Mr. Blackwood's house when I heard voices outside. I looked through the window and saw a car in the driveway. Isabella Cunningham got out of the car with Mr. Jonathan Hayes, who I recognized because he sometimes visited Mr. Blackwood on business. They were arguing. I hid in the pantry because I was not supposed to be working so late, and Mr. Hayes didn't know I was there. I heard Isabella say she had evidence about Mr. Hayes and Mr. Blackwood stealing money from the church and other charities. She said she had found documents proving they were taking donations meant for poor families and keeping the money for themselves. Mr. Hayes was very angry. He said Isabella didn't understand how business worked, that she was just a naive little girl who should keep her mouth shut. Isabella said she couldn't stay quiet when people were stealing from God and from families who needed help. I heard sounds of fighting, and then everything was quiet. When I looked out, Mr. Hayes was carrying Isabella to his car. She was not moving. I was so scared. I waited until morning to go back to the house, and I found Isabella's dress hanging in the master bedroom closet. I took the dress because I was afraid Mr. Hayes would come back and destroy it. I could tell that Isabella had sewn something into the lining. I could feel papers inside the fabric. I never opened it because I was too frightened, but I knew it must be the evidence she mentioned. I am sorry I kept this secret so long. I was afraid Mr. Hayes would hurt my family if I told the truth. But now I am old and dying, and I cannot meet God with this lie on my soul. Please forgive me and find justice for Isabella." Detective Mitchell's hands trembled as she examined the dress more carefully. Using small scissors, she carefully opened a section of the inner lining that had been hand-stitched by someone with precise sewing skills. Inside the hidden pocket, wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture, were several documents that would expose a conspiracy of theft and murder that had operated in Ocean View Heights for years. The papers included bank statements showing unauthorized transfers from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church Building Fund, copies of charity donation records that had been falsified, and a detailed letter in Isabella's handwriting describing what she had discovered and her plans to expose the truth. Isabella's hidden letter, dated August 14, 1990, the day before her disappearance, provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. If someone is reading this, it means something has happened to me. I pray it won't be necessary, but I've discovered something terrible and I'm afraid of what Mr. Hayes might do to keep me quiet. For the past 6 months, I've been helping Mrs. Patterson organize donation records at the homeless shelter. I noticed that several large donations that were supposed to come from our church never arrived. When I asked Pastor Wellington about it, he showed me the church's records indicating the money had been sent, but the amounts were different from what the shelter received. I started investigating and discovered that Mr. Jonathan Hayes, who manages financial contributions for several churches and charities in our area, has been stealing money meant for poor families. He takes donations intended for homeless shelters, food banks, and emergency assistance programs, then only passes along a fraction of what was actually donated while keeping the rest for himself. The worst part is that Mr. Vincent Blackwood, who owns the Peninsula Estate, is his business partner in this scheme. They've been using Mr. Blackwood's oil company accounts to hide the stolen money. I have copies of bank records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars that should have gone to help families in need. I confronted Mr. Hayes yesterday at his office. I told him I knew what he was doing and that I was going to expose everything. He became very angry and said I didn't understand how the adult world worked. He said if I caused trouble, my family would suffer consequences I couldn't imagine. But I can't stay quiet when I know people are stealing from God and from families who desperately need help. The Bible says in Proverbs 31 verses 8-9, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy." I've sewn these documents into my Sweet 16 dress because I'm wearing it tomorrow night and I want to make sure the evidence is safe with me. If anything happens to me, I pray someone will find these papers and make sure justice is done. I'm not afraid to die if that's what God requires of me to protect innocent families. My faith tells me that God sees everything, and that truth will eventually come to light. I love my parents and I'm sorry if my actions cause them pain, but I have to do what's right. Isabella Marie Cunningham, August 14, 1990 inch. Detective Mitchell immediately contacted the FBI and the California Attorney General's office. The evidence sewn into Isabella's dress would ultimately lead to one of the largest charity fraud investigations in California history, exposing a network of corruption that had stolen millions of dollars from churches, charities, and non-profit organizations across the state. Jonathan Hayes, now 65 years old and living in Montana under an assumed name, was arrested within a week of the dress being discovered. DNA evidence on the documents matched samples found in his former office, and handwriting analysis confirmed that he had forged numerous donation records over the years. Under pressure from federal prosecutors and faced with overwhelming evidence, Hayes confessed to Isabella's murder. His account of that August night in 1990 matched Elena Santos' description, with additional horrifying details about how he had disposed of Isabella's body in the Pacific Ocean, weighted down so it would never be found. "I never meant for it to go that far," Hayes told investigators during his confession. "Isabella was just a kid, but she was going to destroy everything I had built. I tried to reason with her, to make her understand that she was in over her head. But she wouldn't listen. She kept talking about God and justice and doing the right thing. When I realized she was never going to stay quiet, I lost control." Hayes had lured Isabella to the Peninsula Estate under the pretense of showing her additional evidence that would help her expose the charity fraud. Instead, he had killed her and disposed of her body, then carefully staged the scene to make it appear she had simply vanished. He had hung her dress in Blackwood's closet, knowing that when it was found, suspicion would fall on the oil executive rather than on him. Vincent Blackwood, it turned out, had been completely innocent of any wrongdoing related to Isabella's disappearance, though the investigation revealed he had unknowingly had his business accounts used in Hayes' money laundering scheme. Blackwood had been in Texas during the crucial period, exactly as he had claimed, and had no knowledge of Hayes' criminal activities. The case's resolution brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to Ocean View Heights. After 25 years of questions, the community finally knew what had happened to Isabella Cunningham. But learning that she had been murdered for trying to protect poor families and expose corruption only deepened the tragedy of her loss. Margaret Cunningham, now 67 years old and remarried to a kind physician in San Francisco, broke down when Detective Mitchell called to tell her about the discovery. "My beautiful girl died because she couldn't stand to see people stealing from the poor," Margaret sobbed. "That's exactly what Isabella would do, put herself at risk to protect others who couldn't protect themselves." Robert Cunningham, who had remarried and moved to Oregon, drove back to Ocean View Heights immediately upon hearing the news. For the first time in 25 years, he and Margaret stood together at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where a memorial service was held for their daughter. Pastor Wellington, now in his 70s but still serving the congregation, delivered a sermon that many described as the most powerful they had ever heard. He spoke about Isabella's faith, her courage, and her ultimate sacrifice in the name of justice for the poor and vulnerable. Isabella Cunningham was 16 years old when she chose to stand up for people she had never met, people who couldn't defend themselves against those who would steal from them, Pastor Wellington said, his voice strong despite his tears. She knew the risks, but her faith compelled her to act. She sewed evidence into her party dress because she was determined that truth would survive even if she didn't. The memorial service was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had benefited from Isabella's volunteer work and others who had been inspired by her story over the years. Representatives from every homeless shelter, food bank, and charity organization in the region came to honor the memory of a teenager who had died protecting their mission. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, Elena Santos' granddaughter who had discovered the dress, spoke about her grandmother's decades of guilt and fear. "My grandmother carried this secret for 25 years because she was terrified of what would happen to our family if she told the truth. But she could never bring herself to destroy Isabella's dress because she knew it contained evidence that would someday bring justice." In the months following Hayes' arrest and confession, investigators discovered that his charity fraud scheme had stolen over $3 million that should have gone to help poor families, homeless individuals, and emergency assistance programs. The money had been used to fund Hayes' lavish lifestyle, including expensive cars, vacation homes, and gambling habits. Isabella Cunningham's courage in exposing this fraud ultimately saved countless families who would have been victimized in the future, FBI Special Agent David Park explained to reporters. Her evidence not only solved her own murder but prevented years of additional theft from some of our community's most vulnerable citizens. The Isabella Cunningham Foundation was established by her parents, using money recovered from Hayes' assets and additional contributions from community members. The foundation provides emergency assistance, housing support, and educational scholarships for families in need, continuing the work that Isabella had died trying to protect. Jonathan Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Isabella's murder, plus additional sentences for the charity fraud charges. At his sentencing hearing, he was confronted by dozens of families who had been harmed by his theft of funds intended to help them during their times of greatest need. "You didn't just steal money," testified Maria Gonzalez, a single mother whose emergency housing assistance had been delayed because of Hayes' theft. "You stole hope from families who had nowhere else to turn. And you murdered a beautiful young woman whose only crime was caring about people like us." The courtroom fell silent when Margaret Cunningham stood to address her daughter's killer. Dressed in the same shade of ivory that Isabella had worn to her Sweet 16 party, Margaret's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "For 25 years, I wondered what happened to my daughter. I wondered if she had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had thought about her family in her final moments," Margaret said, looking directly at Hayes. "Now I know that Isabella died exactly as she lived, standing up for what was right, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and trusting in God even in the face of evil." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "You took my daughter's life, but you could not take her legacy. Every family that receives help from the Isabella Cunningham Foundation is proof that her courage still lives. Every person who reads her story and decides to stand up for justice is proof that she did not die in vain. As Margaret spoke, Hayes broke down completely, sobbing and asking for forgiveness. But Margaret's response reflected the strength and faith that had carried her through 25 years of uncertainty. I forgive you because that's what Isabella would want me to do. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, and that is justice. The story of Isabella Cunningham's disappearance and the discovery of her hidden evidence became national news, inspiring discussions about courage, faith, and the responsibility to protect vulnerable members of society. Her story was featured in documentaries, books, and television programs that highlighted both the tragedy of her murder and the triumph of her eventual justice. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church commissioned a stained glass window in Isabella's memory, depicting a young woman holding a Bible and standing protectively in front of children and families. The inscription below reads, Isabella Marie Cunningham, 1974–1990, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Proverbs 31 verse 8". The window catches the California sunlight each morning during services, casting colorful patterns across the sanctuary where Isabella once taught Sunday school and sang in the youth choir. Pastor Wellington often reflects during his sermons on how Isabella's faith sustained her even in her final moments, giving her the courage to hide evidence that would eventually bring justice. On what would have been Isabella's 41st birthday in 2015, the city of Ocean View Heights declared August 15 as Isabella Cunningham Day, dedicated to community service and support for local charities. Every year on that date, hundreds of volunteers participate in service projects, donation drives, and educational programs about protecting vulnerable populations. The Peninsula Estate, where Isabella's dress was found, was donated by Vincent Blackwood to become a transitional housing facility for homeless families. Blackwood, who had been deeply affected by learning how his property was used in the cover-up of Isabella's murder, wanted to ensure that the mansion would serve families in need rather than continuing as a symbol of wealth and privilege. I can't change what happened in my house 25 years ago, Blackwood said during the dedication ceremony. But I can make sure that from now on, these walls shelter families who need protection rather than hiding evidence of terrible crimes. Elena Santos' confession letter and Isabella's hidden evidence are now displayed at the Ocean View Heights Historical Society, along with photographs and memorabilia from Isabella's life. The exhibit, titled Faith in Action, The Isabella Cunningham Story, educates visitors about the importance of standing up for justice even when it requires personal sacrifice. School groups regularly visit the exhibit, where docents share Isabella's story as an example of how young people can make a difference in their communities. Many students leave inspired to volunteer with local charities or to speak up when they witness injustice. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, who discovered the dress in her grandmother's attic, became a prominent advocate for victims' rights and established a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in social justice. She often speaks about how her grandmother's decision to preserve Isabella's dress, despite decades of fear, ultimately allowed truth to triumph over evil. My grandmother was terrified for 25 years, but her conscience wouldn't let her destroy that dress, Dr. Rodriguez explains to audiences. She knew that Isabella had sewn evidence into the fabric for a reason, and she trusted that someday, God would reveal the truth. Her faith was rewarded, and justice was finally served. The story of Isabella's Sweet 16 dress and its hidden message has become a powerful symbol of how truth can remain hidden for decades but will eventually come to light. The dress itself, after being processed as evidence and used in Hayes' trial, was returned to the Cunningham family and is now displayed at the Isabella Cunningham Foundation headquarters. Visitors to the foundation often pause before the display case containing the ivory gown, reading Isabella's hidden letter and marveling at the courage of a 16-year-old who was willing to die rather than allow vulnerable families to be victimized. The dress serves as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evil, individual acts of courage and faith can change the world. Margaret Cunningham, now in her 70s, regularly speaks at the Foundation's events about her daughter's legacy and the importance of supporting organizations that help vulnerable populations. She always ends her presentations with the same message that Isabella included in her hidden letter, that God sees everything, and that truth will eventually come to light. Isabella believed that God had called her to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, Margaret tells audiences. She knew that standing up for justice might cost her everything, but her faith told her that doing the right thing was more important than staying safe. 25 years later, her courage is still protecting families in need. The Isabella Cunningham Foundation has grown into one of California's most effective charitable organizations, providing millions of dollars in assistance to homeless families, funding emergency housing programs, and supporting educational initiatives for disadvantaged children. Every dollar donated to the foundation is carefully monitored and accounted for, ensuring that the corruption Isabella died fighting against can never happen again. On quiet Sunday mornings at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, when the California sun streams through Isabella's memorial window and illuminates the sanctuary where she once worshipped, Pastor Wellington often reflects on the mystery of divine timing. How was it that Elena Santos' granddaughter discovered the dress exactly 25 years after Isabella's disappearance? How was it that the evidence sewn into the fabric survived decades in storage, preserved perfectly for the day when justice could finally be served? God's timing is not our timing, Pastor Wellington often says during his sermons. We wanted answers immediately after Isabella disappeared. We wanted justice right away. But God knew that 25 years later, when technology and circumstances were right, Isabella's own evidence would speak from beyond the grave to convict her killer and expose the corruption she died fighting against. The faith community in Ocean View Heights, which had struggled with questions about God's protection and justice in the wake of Isabella's disappearance, found their belief strengthened by the ultimate resolution of her case. Her story became proof that even when evil seems to triumph temporarily, God's justice will eventually prevail. Young people in the community, particularly teenage girls, often cite Isabella as an inspiration for their own service work and advocacy efforts. The Isabella Cunningham Youth Leadership Program, established by the Foundation, trains high school students to identify and address social justice issues in their communities, continuing Isabella's mission of speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves. As the sun sets over the Pacific Ocean each evening, casting golden light across the Victorian mansions of Ocean View Heights, residents often pause to remember the 16-year-old girl who chose courage over safety, truth over silence, and justice over personal security. Her legacy lives on in every family helped by her foundation, every student inspired by her example, and every person who chooses to stand up for what is right even when it requires personal sacrifice. Isabella Marie Cunningham's Sweet 16 party was supposed to be a celebration of her transition from childhood to adulthood. Instead, it became the night she demonstrated the kind of moral courage that many adults never develop. Her hidden message, sewn into the fabric of her party dress with careful stitches and unwavering faith, ensured that her voice would continue speaking for justice long after her own voice had been silenced. The mystery of her disappearance may have taken 25 years to solve, but the truth she died protecting has continued to transform lives and protect vulnerable families every day since. In the end, Isabella's faith proved stronger than her killer's evil, her courage proved more enduring than his cruelty, and her love for justice proved more powerful than his greed. She disappeared at her Sweet 16 party, but through her own careful preparation and unshakable faith, she made sure that her voice would never truly be silenced. The note sewn into her dress wasn't just evidence of corruption, it was a testament to the power of young people to change the world when they have the courage to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. 28 years after the case was solved, in 2023, Margaret Cunningham stood once again in the sanctuary of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, now 95 years old but still sharp and dignified. She was there for the dedication of a new wing of the Isabella Cunningham Foundation headquarters, funded by a surprise bequest from Vincent Blackwood, who had passed away the previous year. Isabella would be 59 years old today if she had lived, Margaret said to the assembled crowd, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. Sometimes I wonder what she would have accomplished, what kind of woman she would have become. But then I look around at all the lives that have been changed because of her courage, and I realize that her life wasn't cut short, it was transformed into something eternal. Pastor Wellington's son, Michael Wellington, had taken over leadership of St. Matthew's after his father's retirement. He often told newcomers to the congregation about Isabella's story, explaining how a 16-year-old girl's faith had changed not just their church, but their entire understanding of what it means to trust God's timing. When Isabella disappeared in 1990, many people in this congregation questioned whether God truly protects the innocent, Pastor Michael would say during orientation sessions for new members. Her story teaches us that sometimes God's protection doesn't look like what we expect. Sometimes it means that even in death, truth prevails, justice is served, and lives continue to be transformed for good. The Isabella Cunningham Youth Leadership Program had grown into a national organization by 2023, with chapters in all 50 states and partnerships with churches, schools, and community organizations across the country. Young people who completed the program's training in social justice advocacy often went on to careers in law, social work, ministry, and public service. Amanda Sinclair, Isabella's childhood best friend, had become a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. She often credited Isabella's story with inspiring her career choice. When I was 16, I watched my best friend choose justice over safety, Amanda would tell young prosecutors she mentored. Isabella taught me that the law isn't just about punishment, it's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, who had discovered the dress in her grandmother's attic, established a fellowship program that sent medical students to serve in underserved communities. The program's motto, taken from Isabella's hidden letter, read, "We cannot stay quiet when we know people are suffering and we have the power to help." Elena Santos' confession letter had been translated into multiple languages and was studied in criminal justice programs as an example of how witnesses can be traumatized by threats and intimidation, sometimes carrying secrets for decades before finding the courage to speak. Her story led to new protocols for protecting witnesses and encouraging them to come forward with information about unsolved crimes. The original Sweet 16 dress, preserved in its display case at the Foundation headquarters, had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for families who had lost children to violence. Parents would bring photographs of their own children, placing them beside Isabella's portrait and asking for strength to continue seeking justice. "There's something about seeing that dress," explained Susan Morrison, a mother whose daughter had been murdered in 2018. "It reminds you that even when evil seems to win, truth has a way of surviving." Isabella's dress carried evidence for 25 years until the right moment came for justice to be served. "It gives me hope that my daughter's case will be solved too." The Peninsula Estate, which had been converted into transitional housing for homeless families, served as many as 50 families at a time. The mansion's grand ballroom, where Isabella's dress had been found hanging in a closet, was now used as a community center where residents could attend job training classes, support group meetings, and educational programs. Maria Santos, who had been the original housekeeper at the estate in 1990, lived long enough to see the property transformed into a place of healing and hope. Before her death in 2020 at age 95, she had become something of a grandmother figure to the families staying there, often telling them Isabella's story as an example of how God can bring good from even the darkest situations. "Miss Isabella died trying to protect families just like you," Maria would tell residents during the weekly community dinners held in the mansion's dining room. "Now her spirit lives on in this house, making sure that families who need shelter find it here. When you feel discouraged, remember that you are sleeping under a roof that was blessed by the sacrifice of a girl who loved God and loved justice. The investigation into Hayes' charity fraud had ultimately led to reforms in how nonprofit organizations handle and report donations. The Isabella Cunningham Transparency Act, passed by the California legislature in 2018, required detailed public reporting of all charitable donations over a certain threshold and established stronger penalties for theft from charitable organizations. Jonathan Hayes died in prison in 2021, having served only 6 years of his life sentence. His death from a heart attack came just 2 weeks after he had finally agreed to meet with Margaret Cunningham, who had been writing to him for years asking for information about Isabella's final moments. In their only conversation, conducted by video call due to COVID-19 restrictions, Hayes had broken down while describing Isabella's last words to him. "She said she forgave me," he told Margaret through his tears. "Even when she knew I was going to kill her, she said she forgave me and that she would pray for my soul. I've heard those words every day for 31 years. Margaret had listened to his confession with the same grace that had sustained her through decades of grief. "Isabella forgave you because that's who she was," Margaret told him. "And because of her forgiveness, you have the opportunity to find peace with God before you die. Don't waste that gift." Hayes had asked to be baptized before his death, and a prison chaplain had performed the ceremony in the prison hospital chapel. His final letter to Margaret, written just days before his fatal heart attack, expressed gratitude for her forgiveness and included a donation of his remaining personal assets to the Isabella Cunningham Foundation. "I know money can't bring Isabella back or erase what I did," Hayes wrote. "But maybe it can help one more family that needs assistance. Isabella died protecting people like that, and I want to honor her memory in the only way I can." The annual Isabella Cunningham Day celebrations had grown into major community events in Ocean View Heights and dozens of other cities where foundation chapters operated. The 2023 celebration, marking 33 years since Isabella's disappearance, drew over 10,000 participants to Ocean View Heights for a day of service projects, educational workshops, and remembrance ceremonies. Margaret Cunningham, despite her advanced age, still insisted on participating in every activity. She could be seen reading to children at the homeless shelter where Isabella had volunteered, serving meals at the community dinner, and speaking with young activists who sought her advice about their own social justice work. "Mrs. Cunningham is living proof that grief can be transformed into purpose," observed Dr. Rachel Chen, a grief counselor who had studied the Cunningham family's journey for her doctoral dissertation. Instead of being consumed by bitterness over her daughter's murder, Margaret chose to honor Isabella's memory by continuing the work she died protecting. "That's not just healing, that's resurrection." Robert Cunningham, now 85 and battling Parkinson's disease, had returned to Ocean View Heights in 2022 to be closer to the foundation's work. His relationship with Margaret, while never fully reconciled romantically, had healed into a deep friendship based on their shared love for Isabella's memory and commitment to her legacy. "We were broken apart by grief 30 years ago," Robert explained to a documentary filmmaker in 2023. "But Isabella's story brought us back together, not as husband and wife, but as partners in continuing her mission. We discovered that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to." The original Rosehaven estate, where Isabella had grown up, had been purchased by the foundation in 2019 and converted into a retreat center for families dealing with the loss of children to violence. The mansion's gardens, where Isabella had once played as a child, were now peaceful meditation spaces where grieving parents could find solace and hope. Isabella's childhood bedroom had been preserved exactly as it was in 1990, with her pink and gold decor, her collection of books, and her diary from the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Visitors often commented on the maturity of her writings, the depth of her faith reflections, and her obvious concern for people who were suffering. One entry, dated just a week before her disappearance, seemed particularly prophetic. "I've been reading about the martyrs in church history, people who died rather than betray their faith or abandon their principles. I used to think I could never be that brave. But now I understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to do what's right even when you're afraid. If God ever calls me to be that brave, I pray He'll give me the strength to say yes." The room also contained the sewing machine where Isabella had learned to stitch the evidence into her dress. A small placard explained how she had used skills her grandmother had taught her to create the hidden pocket that would preserve crucial evidence for 25 years. Pastor Michael Wellington had established a tradition of ending each Sunday service with what he called Isabella's Prayer, based on words found in her personal journal. "Lord, help us to see injustice wherever it exists, give us courage to stand up for what is right, and grant us faith to trust that truth will always prevail, even when we cannot see how. May our lives be a light in the darkness and a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Amen." The prayer had been adopted by hundreds of other churches across the country, many of which had also established their own social justice ministries inspired by Isabella's example. The Isabella network of churches had become a powerful force for advocacy and change, particularly in the areas of poverty alleviation and protection of vulnerable populations. As Margaret Cunningham approached her 96th birthday in 2024, she reflected on the long journey from the night Isabella disappeared to the thriving foundation that bore her name. The foundation had helped over 100,000 families, provided millions of dollars in emergency assistance, and trained thousands of young advocates for social justice. When Isabella was born, the doctor told us she would be special, Margaret remembered during an interview with a television reporter. "We thought he meant she would be smart or talented or beautiful. We never imagined that her specialness would lie in her willingness to die for others. But that's exactly what makes her story so powerful. She was an ordinary teenager who chose to do something extraordinary." The reporter asked Margaret if she ever regretted that Isabella had gotten involved in exposing the charity fraud, knowing that it cost her daughter her life. "Never," Margaret replied without hesitation. Isabella made a choice based on her faith and her values. She chose to protect innocent families rather than protect herself. "As her mother, I'm proud of that choice, even though it broke my heart." The alternative would have been for Isabella to live with the knowledge that she could have helped people but chose not to. That wasn't who she was. The interview concluded with Margaret standing in front of the stained glass window at St. Matthew's Church, the afternoon sun casting colorful patterns around her frail but determined figure. "Isabella's body may be gone," she said, "but her spirit lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, truth over silence, and love over fear. That's not just her legacy, that's her resurrection." As the documentary camera captured the scene, viewers could see the truth of Margaret's words reflected in the faces of the dozens of young volunteers working throughout the church, preparing for another day of service to their community. Isabella's influence had indeed transcended death, creating a ripple effect of compassion and justice that continued to expand with each passing year. The final image of the documentary was the ivory dress in its display case, a small spotlight illuminating the delicate beadwork that had once made a 16-year-old girl feel like a princess. But now the dress represented something far more significant than adolescent dreams. It had become a symbol of how faith, courage, and careful preparation can preserve truth until the moment when justice can finally be served. Visitors to the foundation often left messages in a guest book beside the dress display. The entries, written in dozens of languages by people from around the world, shared a common theme: gratitude for Isabella's example and determination to carry forward her mission of protecting the vulnerable and exposing corruption. One entry, written by a teenage girl from Detroit who had started her own anti-bullying program at school, captured the essence of Isabella's enduring impact. Isabella, thank you for showing me that age doesn't matter when it comes to standing up for what's right. You were only 16, but you had more courage than most adults ever develop. Because of your example, I'm not afraid to speak up when I see injustice. Your voice is still changing the world. As the years continued to pass and new generations discovered Isabella's story, her influence showed no signs of diminishing. Each retelling of her disappearance, the discovery of her hidden evidence, and the ultimate triumph of justice inspired new advocates, new charitable efforts, and new examples of young people choosing to stand up for others despite personal risk. The girl who had disappeared at her sweet 16 party had indeed become a woman, not in the traditional sense of growing older, but in the deeper sense of leaving a legacy that transcended her physical existence. Through the foundation that bore her name, the laws that had been passed in her honor, and the countless lives that had been changed by her example, Isabella Marie Cunningham continued to grow in influence and impact with each passing year. Her story had become more than just a tale of tragedy and eventual justice, it had become a template for how faith, courage, and careful preparation can overcome even the most determined efforts to suppress truth. The note sewn into her dress had spoken from beyond the grave, not just to convict her killer, but to inspire a movement that would outlast any individual life. In the end, Isabella's true Sweet 16 gift to the world was not the party that was interrupted by her disappearance, but the legacy that emerged from her willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of others. She had indeed become a woman that night, not through celebration, but through the kind of moral courage that transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary examples of faith in action.